Emma and Brian had always considered themselves open-minded individuals. Their marriage was unconventional, as they believed in the idea of an open marriage, an arrangement where both partners could have relationships outside of their own. However, this trust would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The couple had been together for 5 years, and their bond seemed unbreakable. They enjoyed traveling and experiencing new things, so when they booked their honeymoon to an exotic island, they anticipated nothing less than perfection. Little did Emma know, the trip would be far from what she had imagined. On the first night of their stay, Brian seemed distant. He was his usual charming self, but Emma could tell something was off. He was preoccupied, his mind somewhere else. When they returned to their hotel room after a late dinner, Brian excused himself to make a phone call. Emma, feeling curious, overheard snippets of his conversation. At first, she thought it was a business call, but as she listened more closely, she realized Brian wasn't talking to anyone about work. His tone was different, more intimate. He spoke to the person on the other end with a kind of affection Emma had never heard from him. The words, "I miss you," and "I can't wait to see you again," sent a chill down her spine. Heart pounding, Emma slipped quietly to the door and peered out from the crack. She saw Brian standing by the window, phone in hand, smiling as he spoke. Her stomach twisted with unease, but she didn't confront him right away. Instead, she spent the night trying to process the confusing and conflicting emotions swirling inside her. The following morning, Emma's suspicions grew. As they sat by the pool, she noticed Brian's behavior was unusually guarded. He wasn't his usual affectionate self. Emma felt a surge of anxiety building within her, realizing that something wasn't right. She needed to know the truth, so she decided to confront him that evening. Over dinner, Emma asked Brian if he had anything he wanted to tell her. His face immediately drained of color. He looked away, fidgeting with his fork. It wasn't like him to act this way. Brian finally admitted to having an affair, but not just any affair. He confessed that he had been seeing someone for months. What he didn't expect was for Emma to ask the name of the other person. "His name is Jake," Brian said, his voice almost a whisper. "He's someone I met years ago, and things just happened." Emma sat in stunned silence, unable to process his words. She had always thought that their open marriage was based on trust and mutual understanding, but now she realized that Brian had crossed a line that she didn't know could be crossed. Brian's voice faltered as he explained that he never meant for it to go this far, that it was only supposed to be an occasional fling, something that didn't mean anything. But Emma couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. She felt like the very foundation of their marriage had crumbled beneath her feet. The revelation of Brian's affair left Emma feeling humiliated and heartbroken. It wasn't just about the affair itself. It was about the lies and the deceit. And the fact that Brian had kept it a secret from her all this time made it even worse. That night after the confrontation, Emma retreated to their room, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do next. Should she confront Jake? Should she leave Brian? Or should she try to salvage whatever was left of their marriage? She couldn't make a decision. But one thing was certain. The honeymoon they had dreamt of for so long was now forever tainted by the truth. The next morning, Emma woke up with a heavy heart. Her mind was still spinning from the events of the previous evening. Brian had apologized repeatedly, insisting that he was sorry for keeping secrets from her and promising that it would never happen again. He begged her to understand that his feelings for Jake were complicated, but Emma felt betrayed beyond words. Emma spent the day wandering through the island, trying to clear her head. She visited a local market, gazed at the serene beauty of the ocean, and tried to focus on anything other than the storm of emotions churning inside her. But everywhere she went, her mind kept returning to the same thoughts: betrayal, confusion, and pain. She returned to their hotel room that evening, the beautiful sunset fading into darkness outside their window. Brian was waiting for her, his face filled with remorse. He reached out to her, but Emma recoiled. "I don't want to talk right now," she said softly. "I need space." Brian nodded, clearly crushed. He respected her wishes, giving her the time she needed. Emma took a deep breath and walked out onto the balcony. She stared out at the ocean, her mind racing. Her thoughts kept spiraling, not only about Brian's affair, but about the man he had been hiding from her all this time. Jake. The thought of Jake made Emma feel sick to her stomach. Who was he? What was his relationship with Brian? And how long had this been going on? That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The bed felt cold and empty, even though Brian was lying beside her. She tried to ignore the rising anger and confusion, but the more she thought about it, the more her mind became consumed with the need to know the full truth. The next morning, Emma couldn't bear it any longer. She had to find out everything. If Brian was going to be honest with her, then she needed to confront the source of the pain. Jake. While Brian was in the shower, Emma quickly grabbed his phone from the bedside table. Her hands shook as she unlocked it. She had no idea what she was looking for, but she felt like she needed to understand more. As she scrolled through his messages, she found dozens of texts from someone named Jake. The words were intimate, loving, and filled with longing. The messages weren't just about a fling, they were about something deeper, something more serious. Jake had been a part of Brian's life for a long time, longer than Emma had known. She felt a surge of betrayal flood her chest as she read through the messages. Jake's text revealed a hidden side of Brian, a side she never knew existed. But it was one particular message that struck Emma to the core. Jake had sent Brian a text that read, "I can't wait to be with you again. I know we can't be together openly, but one day we will be. I love you." Emma froze. She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. Brian had fallen in love with Jake. It wasn't just about physical attraction. It was something deeper, something real. The realization hit Emma like a ton of bricks. Brian's affair wasn't just a mistake or a temporary fling. It was a reflection of something she couldn't ignore anymore. Brian had been living a lie, and so had she. Just as Emma was trying to process this new revelation, Brian walked back into the room fresh from the shower. He immediately noticed the tension in the air, and the phone clutched tightly in Emma's hands. "Emma, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with fear. Emma didn't answer right away. She couldn't. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "You love him, don't you?" she asked quietly. Brian's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The truth hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with guilt and regret. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Emma," Brian said, his voice breaking. "But yes, I love him. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Emma felt like the world was collapsing around her. She had always trusted Brian, and now everything was unraveling before her eyes. Her heart ached as she realized that the life they had built together was based on a foundation of lies. She stood up abruptly, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't be with someone who doesn't love me the way I love them." Brian reached for her, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "No, Brian, I need to figure out what to do. I need time away from you. I need space to think." Brian's eyes filled with desperation. "Please, Emma, don't leave me. We can fix this. We can work through this together." But Emma knew it was too late. She had to get away. She needed to clear her head. She couldn't stand to be around him, not with this new knowledge hanging over her. "I'm going to take a walk," she said, her voice hoarse. "I'll be back later." With that, Emma left the room, leaving Brian standing in the middle of the hotel room, crushed by the weight of his own lies. As Emma walked out into the night, she knew one thing for certain: things would never be the same again. Emma spent the next few hours walking aimlessly around the island, her mind trapped in a whirlwind of thoughts. The beauty of the surrounding environment felt distant and irrelevant as her heart wrestled with the enormity of what she had learned. Her mind kept circling around the same questions. How long had Brian been seeing Jake? Why had he kept it from her? And most importantly, how could she move forward from this betrayal? She found herself near the beach, watching the waves crash against the shore. The sound was soothing, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside her. The anger she felt was overwhelming, but so was the sense of profound sadness. Brian had lied to her, not just about the affair, but about something far deeper: his feelings, his desires. He had been living a double life, and she had been none the wiser. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Brian. Emma, please, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Can we please talk? I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. I love you, and I don't want to lose you. Emma stared at the message, her finger hovering over the screen. She wanted to respond, to tell him how she felt, but the words seemed inadequate. Nothing could express the depth of her pain. Instead, she placed her phone back into her pocket and continued walking along the beach, trying to clear her head. As the sun began to set, Emma made her way back to the hotel. She wasn't ready to face Brian yet, but she knew she couldn't keep running. She needed to confront him, to hear what he had to say and make sense of it all. When she returned to the room, she found Brian sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He looked up at her as she entered, his face filled with guilt and remorse. The sight of him made Emma's heart ache, but the anger inside her kept her from rushing into his arms. I need to understand, Brian, Emma said quietly, her voice trembling with the emotion she was trying to suppress. I need to know how this happened. How did we get here? Brian stood up, pacing the room nervously. He didn't know where to begin. It's complicated, Emma. It wasn't something I planned. I never meant for you to find out like this. I don't care about your excuses, Emma snapped, the anger bubbling to the surface. You lied to me, Brian. For months you lied to me. You were seeing someone behind my back, and you didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth. Brian winced, the words hitting him like a physical blow. I didn't want to hurt you, Emma. I thought I could keep it separate, keep it from affecting our marriage. But I was wrong. I was selfish. The words hung in the air, but Emma couldn't bring herself to respond. She was too hurt, too betrayed. Her mind raced with images of Brian and Jake together, of the love they had shared in secret. It felt like a slap in the face, and it cut deeper than she had ever imagined possible. I don't know what to do anymore, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can forgive you. Brian took a step toward her, his face desperate. Please, Emma, don't give up on us. I'll do anything. I'll end things with Jake. I'll prove to you that you're the one I love. Emma recoiled from him, her chest tightening with a mixture of sorrow and anger. No, Brian, you don't get it. It's not just about Jake. It's about the fact that you didn't trust me enough to be honest with me. You didn't think I could handle the truth. You've been living a lie, and I've been living one right along with you. The weight of her words settled over them both, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Brian's eyes filled with tears as he reached out for her, but Emma stepped back, shaking her head. I need some time, Brian, she said, her voice breaking. I can't do this right now. I need to be alone. Brian nodded silently, his face filled with regret. He watched as Emma gathered her things and walked out of the room, leaving him standing alone in the midst of the shattered remains of their marriage. Later that night, Emma returned to her room, her heart heavy with the realization that things could never go back to the way they were. She knew she needed answers, but the more she thought about the situation, the more overwhelmed she became. She had trusted Brian, and now she was left questioning everything. Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it to find another message from him. Please, Emma, I love you. Don't walk away from us. I'll prove to you that you're everything to me. Tears filled her eyes as she stared at the screen. She wanted to believe him, to believe that their love could overcome this. But a small voice inside her whispered that it might be too late for that. Emma knew that she couldn't make a decision in the heat of the moment. She needed time to think, time to process the pain and betrayal she felt. Days passed since Emma confronted Brian. The peaceful island that had once symbolized their new beginning now felt like a prison. Emma couldn't shake the image of Brian's tear-filled eyes, the desperation in his voice when he begged her not to leave. But the pain she felt was too great to ignore. And every time she tried to picture a future with him, all she could see was betrayal. The marriage they had shared seemed like a distant memory now, overshadowed by the lie that had shattered everything. Brian, on the other hand, was unraveling. Despite his promises to end things with Jake, the weight of his actions was taking its toll. He barely slept. He barely ate. He spent most of his days pacing around the hotel room, consumed by guilt. He knew he had lost Emma, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. He was torn between his feelings for Jake and his desperate desire to salvage his marriage. The tension between them was unbearable, and neither of them seemed capable of moving forward. They would barely speak to each other, avoiding eye contact whenever they crossed paths. The once affectionate gestures, hugs, kisses, words of comfort, had all disappeared, replaced by cold silence. Emma no longer knew who the man in front of her was. One evening, after another strained dinner, Emma decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her head and escape from the suffocating atmosphere in their room. As she left the hotel, she made her way down a narrow path that led to a secluded part of the island. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting a peaceful glow over the scene, but Emma couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her chest. As she walked along the beach, lost in her thoughts, a voice behind her made her stop in her tracks. Emma. She turned around to see Brian standing a few feet away. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quiet and strained. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She had been avoiding this conversation, but now it seemed inevitable. She crossed her arms over her chest, trying to steel herself against whatever he was about to say. "I'm listening," she said, her tone flat. Brian took a deep breath, his hands trembling as he stepped closer to her. "I've made a horrible mistake, Emma. I never wanted any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you, but I can't keep living this lie anymore." Emma's heart twisted at his words, but she refused to let herself believe him. "Then why did you lie to me, Brian? Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning?" "I didn't know how to," he said, his voice breaking. "I was scared. I was scared of losing you, and I was scared of losing myself. But I know now that I've lost everything. I can't keep living like this." Emma could see the tears welling up in his eyes, and for a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. But the anger inside her was still too strong. "What about Jake, Brian? What are you going to do about him?" Brian looked away, his expression filled with shame. I don't know. I don't know how to let go of him. But I know that I can't continue to hurt you. I don't want to lose you, Emma. I love you." The words hung in the air between them, and Emma could feel the heaviness of the moment. She had spent so much time thinking about what they had, and now she had to face the fact that it might be over. Could she forgive him? Could she trust him again after everything he had done? But just as Emma was about to speak, she heard a sound in the distance, footsteps approaching from the darkness. Both Emma and Brian turned to look, startled. From the shadows a figure emerged. It was Jake. He was standing at the edge of the beach, staring at them with an unreadable expression on his face. He looked like he had been there for some time, watching them from a distance. The air between the three of them was charged with tension, the silence deafening. Emma's stomach churned as she realized that Jake was a part of this mess. He was part of the reason for her pain, for the unraveling of her marriage. Brian stepped forward, his face conflicted. "Jake, what are you doing here?" Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked closer, his eyes locked on Emma. "I couldn't just let you two talk without knowing the truth," Jake said, his voice calm but firm. "You deserve to know everything." Emma felt her heart race as she turned her gaze toward Jake. What was he talking about? Was there more to this story than she had realized? "I never meant for you to find out like this," Jake continued, glancing at Brian before focusing on Emma. "But I've been in love with Brian for a long time, and I know that the two of us can never truly be together. But I couldn't let him go. I couldn't watch him destroy himself for someone who didn't understand him the way I do." Emma's head spun. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to come together, but it didn't make any sense. The days after Emma's confrontation with Brian and Jake felt like an endless blur. Every step she took seemed to echo the pain that was lodged deep inside her heart. She had left them both on the beach that night, walking away from the men who had once been the center of her world. But as much as she wanted to escape, the hurt wouldn't fade. Every time she closed her eyes, the memories of their shared moments, the laughter, the affection, turned to ashes in her mind. Back in the hotel room, Brian and Jake were no better. Brian hadn't left the room for days, consumed by guilt, self-loathing, and the haunting realization that his relationship with Emma was over. Jake had tried to reach out to him, but Brian was distant, trapped in his thoughts. But Emma had already made up her mind. She couldn't stay on the island any longer. She needed to go back home, away from the painful memories, away from the deceit. Her marriage to Brian, the life they had built together, was no more. As the sun set that evening, Emma packed her things, her hands shaking as she stuffed her clothes into a suitcase. Every piece of clothing felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. As she finished packing, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew who it was. When she opened the door, Brian stood there, his face haggard and worn. His eyes were red, and his posture was defeated. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension between them was palpable. "I've been thinking about what you said," Brian finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve anything from you, but I need you to know that I regret everything. I never meant for things to turn out like this." Emma didn't respond right away. The emotions inside her were tangled, confusing, like a storm she couldn't control. She didn't want to hear him anymore. The words he spoke felt hollow, meaningless. He had betrayed her in ways that couldn't be fixed with apologies. "I'm leaving, Brian," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "I can't do this anymore. I can't live in a lie." Brian stepped forward, his face pleading. "Emma, please, don't leave like this. I'll make it right. I'll do anything." Emma shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's too late, Brian. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. I can't keep living like this." With a heavy heart, Emma turned away from him, walking towards the door. Brian didn't stop her this time. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her as she left, but she didn't turn back. She didn't have the strength to stay in the hotel another night. She needed to go back to her life, to the life she had known before, the life that no longer had a place for Brian or Jake in it. The following morning, Emma boarded a flight back home, the sense of finality settling over her like a heavy fog. She felt numb, unable to process the heartbreak she had experienced, unable to understand what had gone wrong. But one thing was clear: she couldn't go back to a life of lies. Back at home, Emma spent the next few days in a haze. She returned to her apartment. The quiet, solitary space that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison. The memories of her life with Brian lingered around every corner. Photos of them smiling on vacations, their wedding picture on the mantel. All of it now seemed like a distant dream. But it wasn't just the memories of Brian that haunted her. There was the lingering thought of Jake. What kind of man would he be, knowing that he had come between her and Brian? Could he really love Brian the way she had once hoped he could love her? A few days after her return, Emma received a call she wasn't expecting. It was from a detective. "Ms. Richardson?" The detective's voice was calm, but there was an underlying urgency to it. "I need to speak with you about something important." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't know what to expect, but she agreed to meet with him the following day. The detective was waiting for her when she arrived at the small, nondescript office. He was an older man, graying hair at his temples, wearing a worn-out suit that looked like it had seen too many cases. He motioned for her to sit. "I'm Detective Harris," he introduced himself. "I'm investigating a matter that's connected to your recent trip." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of matter?" The detective sighed, pulling out a file from his desk. "It's about Brian and Jake. There's been an incident, a serious one." "An incident?" Emma repeated, her stomach knotting. "What do you mean?" "We found Jake dead, Miss Richardson, murdered." The words hit Emma like a slap in the face. Her mind struggled to process what the detective had just said. Jake? Dead? Murdered? She couldn't wrap her head around it. 1,000 questions flooded her mind, but none of them seemed to make sense. The days following her meeting with Detective Harris felt like they dragged on forever. Emma couldn't stop replaying the conversation in her head, each time the words Brian and murder collided in her mind. She hadn't seen or spoken to Brian since she'd left the island, and the idea that he might be involved in something so horrific seemed impossible. Yet the detective's words echoed in her mind, and she had no choice but to accept that she was now entangled in a much darker story than she ever could have imagined. Detective Harris had been kind enough to explain that while Brian was not yet a suspect, he was certainly a person of interest. According to the coroner, Jake had been found in an isolated part of the beach near the hotel. his body battered and showing signs of blunt force trauma. The circumstances surrounding his death were suspiciously linked to the turmoil between him and Brian. But what had triggered this violent act? Was it an argument that escalated beyond control, or was there something more sinister at play? Emma found herself unable to rest. Her thoughts were consumed with the growing weight of the situation, the possibility that Brian might have acted out of rage, jealousy, or fear. Her heart ached at the thought of everything she had known about him unraveling into something monstrous. That afternoon, Detective Harris reached out to her again, asking if she could come down to the station. She agreed reluctantly, her mind still reeling from the shock of the call. This time she was prepared for the worst, or so she thought. When she arrived, the detective led her into a small windowless room. The walls were covered with case files, photographs, and maps, and the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee. Harris was sitting behind his desk, a file open before him, his face somber. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ms. Richardson, we've gathered more information since our last conversation," Harris began, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet urgency. "We've found some inconsistencies in the statements Brian made to the authorities after Jake's death. And more importantly, we've found something that might connect him to the scene." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to ask, to demand an explanation, but her voice caught in her chest. Harris pushed the file toward her, and she hesitated before looking at it. Inside was a series of photos from the crime scene. The body of Jake, his face bruised and bloodied, lying lifeless on the sand. The image was haunting, but it was the other photo that caught Emma's attention. A broken phone lying next to Jake's body. It was Brian's phone. Her breath hitched. "That's Brian's phone?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harris nodded. "Yes. We found it near the body, and the forensic team confirmed that it belongs to him. The timing is significant. He was in the area around the time of Jake's death. We believe that someone, most likely Brian, dropped the phone in a hurry while fleeing the scene." Emma's mind was reeling. She had never imagined that Brian could be so careless, so reckless. Could he have really killed Jake? Was the grief, the anger that he had shown her just days earlier, masking something far darker inside of him? "Is there any evidence that connects Brian directly to the murder?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "We're still piecing that together," Harris replied. "But there are signs that suggest this wasn't just a moment of rage. The injuries on Jake's body indicate that he was attacked with significant force, and there's no sign of a struggle, which leads us to believe this wasn't an impulsive act. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." Emma felt a chill run through her. "But why would Brian kill Jake?" "We don't know yet," Harris said, his eyes narrowing. "That's why we need your help. We need to understand the dynamics between Brian, you, and Jake. We believe that Brian was conflicted about his relationship with Jake, but something may have triggered this fatal act. Perhaps jealousy, fear of exposure, or even self-defense. We need to know what you can tell us about their relationship." Emma was silent for a long moment, the weight of the question settling over her. Could she help solve the mystery of Jake's death? Could she piece together the clues that might explain what had driven Brian to this violent act? The thoughts swirling in her head were too much for her to process. "I don't know what to tell you," Emma said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know about their relationship until recently. But I can tell you this. When I confronted Brian about it, he seemed lost. He seemed broken. I don't know what that means in the context of what happened to Jake, but I know Brian wasn't the man I thought he was." Harris nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I understand, but anything you can tell us could help us understand what led to Jake's death. This wasn't a random killing. Someone wanted him gone." Emma's heart pounded as she listened to the voice on the other end of the phone. She could feel her breath catch in her throat, the weight of the words sinking in with every passing second. "Ms. Richardson, we found something in Brian's past, something that may explain his actions, or at least give us some insight into the kind of man he's become." Emma's stomach churned. She had already learned so much, and yet the truth still felt like a distant, ever-elusive shadow. She couldn't understand how Brian, the man she had once loved and trusted, had turned into someone capable of murder. But now, with Detective Harris's cryptic statement, she felt that the final piece of the puzzle might be within reach. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been digging into Brian's history, and we came across something troubling," Harris explained, his voice tinged with the exhaustion of a long investigation. "It seems that this wasn't the first time Brian has been involved in a violent altercation. There's a pattern, a history of rage, jealousy, and potentially a deep-seated fear of rejection." Emma's mind raced. She knew there had been something off about Brian, especially in the weeks leading up to their disastrous honeymoon. His behavior had been erratic, filled with shame and guilt that she couldn't understand, but she had never imagined that his past could hold such darkness. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice now shaking with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What kind of history are you talking about? Before you met him, Brian was involved in a long-term relationship with another man. That relationship ended under tragic circumstances," Harris continued. "The man he was with, his name was Thomas, died in a car accident several years ago. But the circumstances surrounding Thomas's death were strange. There were rumors that Brian had been involved in a confrontation just before the accident. We've managed to confirm that Brian was in the car with Thomas when it crashed, and there's reason to believe that the crash may not have been an accident at all." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard anything about Thomas before. The Brian she had married had never mentioned anyone from his past in such a way, and she couldn't understand why he would keep something like this hidden from her. Could it be that the man she thought she knew was not who he claimed to be? "Are you saying that Brian may have been involved in Thomas's death?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We don't have enough evidence to say for sure," Harris replied, "but we're looking into it. The timing of Thomas's death and the way Brian's behavior shifted after it. There's a possibility that Brian's issues with anger and fear of being exposed stem from guilt over what happened with Thomas." Emma's mind spun as the detective's words sank in. Was it possible that Brian had been carrying this burden all along? Was his love for Jake just a symptom of a deeper, more dangerous struggle within him? Was Jake's death the final manifestation of Brian's inner demons, a destructive act triggered by years of buried guilt and anger? "I don't know what to think anymore," Emma whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. "I don't know who Brian is anymore." "I know this is a lot to take in, Miss Richardson," Harris said gently, "but I need you to understand that everything we've uncovered points to one thing. Brian was deeply conflicted, and his actions weren't just a product of his relationship with Jake. They're tied to a much larger, darker part of his past. He was a man struggling with demons, and it seems those demons may have finally consumed him." Emma's heart was shattered. The man she had loved was not just a cheater, not just a man who had betrayed her trust. He was a person who had lived with guilt and shame for years. He had lived in a cage of his own making, hiding his past from her, and now it had finally broken free, taking someone else's life in the process. "Detective," she said, her voice barely audible, "what happens now? We'll continue investigating, and we'll bring Brian in for questioning. We're piecing everything together, and we'll find out exactly what happened the night Jake was killed," Harris replied. "But we need you to be prepared. We may uncover even more than we've already found. We may find that Brian's involvement in Jake's death goes deeper than we thought." Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself against the overwhelming tide of emotions. She had no idea what was coming next, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same. The man she had loved and married had turned into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. She could no longer see him through the lens of the love they had once shared. The truth had emerged, and it was more than she could bear. That night, Emma sat alone in her apartment, her mind swirling with the weight of everything she had learned.